century to serve the new Moloch of manufacture. Under a perpetual blanket of smoke, they were airless, sunless, ridden with disease. Such places where human beings had to live out their lives were truly the dark underside of 19th century civilization. But as the century drew towards its close, one or two far-sighted men began to propose solutions to these evils. An Englishman called Ebenezer Howard suggested that the answer to the horrors of the 19th century city was simply to escape from them altogether out into the countryside. A new kind of city should be built amid the greenery of nature under unpolluted skies, the Garden City. And in 1903 the first Garden City was actually begun at Letchworth, just outside London. A year later, a young French engineer named Tony Garnier began to formulate an even more radical approach to the problem. Looking round at the cities of his time, he asked, what is a city for? It serves, he said, four quite distinct functions. It is a place for living in, a place for working in, a place where men want to move about by various means of transport, and a place where men seek leisure, recreation. What has gone wrong with the 19th century city is that all these four functions have got muddled up. That is why people have to live in the shadow of great factories and railway viaducts. What is needed is an entirely new approach to cities, a planned approach. Cities should be zoned according to their four functions. The factories or industrial zones should be divided off from residential zones. Both should be separated from the main roads and railways, and scattered through the whole, parks or public open spaces for recreation. Garnier spent many years designing his ideal city, and it was to be built not in brick or stone, but in a material combining the best qualities of both. Reinforced concrete, one of the new inventions of the age. Indeed, new technological wonders were suddenly pouring forth on all sides in those early years of the 20th century. The first aeroplanes, motor cars, Marconi's wireless telegraphy. In America, men were awed by the first examples of a new kind of building technique using a metal frame which could soar up many stories above street level. In fact, a new image of extraordinary power was entering the mind of Western man, foreshadowed in H.G. Wells' first full-length science fiction novel, The Sleeper Awakes, as early as 1898, when he imagined the London of the year 2100. An image of overwhelming architecture, an isle of titanic buildings, a hanging cliff edifice with myriads of windows. And across the Atlantic, this image seemed to be coming to reality with astonishing speed. The world began to hear a new word: skyscrapers. But those early years of the 20th century were an age of revolution, not just in technology, but also in art. Artists such as Picasso and Braque, movements such as Cubism and Fauvism, musical innovators like Stravinsky and Schoenberg had thrown the arts of Europe into a ferment. Everywhere, amid sounds and images that seemed shocking, chaotic and new, there were signs of a mighty revolt against the dead academic styles and conventions of the past. And no group of artists in Europe was more intoxicated by the notion that an entirely new age was coming to birth than the Italian Futurists. No artists were more captivated than the Futurists by the thought of the new technological age that was dawning. They were obsessed with the idea of scale, power, dynamism, speed, above all, with machines. In 1914, one of these Italians, Antonio Sant'Elia, published the Manifesto of a Futurist Architecture, in which he proclaimed an end to all the dead museum architecture of the past. We must invent and rebuild the Futurist city, he declared, and in a phrase that was strangely prophetic, the Futurist house must be like a gigantic machine. It must soar up on the brink of a tumultuous abyss. The Futurist architecture is the architecture of reinforced concrete, of steel, of glass. We are the men of immense streets and beneficial demolitions. Within months, these wild and whirling words had been carried away by the deafening eruption of the greatest Holocaust European civilization had ever known. Within a year, young Sant'Elia himself had been killed. 4 years and some 10 million dead later, Europe re-emerged into peace, in ways outwardly very little changed. But the shock of the cataclysm had gone deep. It had hurried on more than ever, a profound yearning for a new age, a new kind of society. In Russia, the largest country in the world, this desire had already been translated into political terms with great violence. In those first heady years after the Bolshevik Revolution, one of the most striking expressions of the vision of a new society coming to birth were the images of gigantic buildings. Mighty towers, strange new dynamic shapes to express the irresistible power of the victorious proletariat. In New York, the ultimate citadel of capitalism, the 20s were the time when the Manhattan skyline was blossoming into one of the most familiar images of the 20th century, in tribute to the dynamic power of money. In Germany, avant-garde young architects were also playing with designs for mighty skyscrapers, men like Mies van der Rohe and Walter Gropius. All over the industrialized world in those years after the First World War, men were conceiving an entirely new, mighty city of the future. In Paris, where for 30 years the tallest building in the world had towered above the skyline as the supreme monument to 19th century engineering skill, an architect named Auguste Perret proclaimed his extraordinary vision of a city of towers. But it was also in Paris in the early 20s that all these myriad images and ideas which had been bubbling round for 20 years or more finally came together in the mind of one man. He was a pupil of Auguste Perret's. His name was Charles-Édouard Jeanneret, although he is better known to the world today under his nom de guerre, Le Corbusier, which means crow-like. Le Corbusier was a perfect combination of all the explosive new forces which had been unleashed in Europe in the first 20 years of the 20th century. As an avant-garde post-cubist painter, he saw himself as an heir to Picasso and Braque. As an architect, he was fascinated by the new skyscrapers and building techniques of America. Like the Italian Futurists, he was moved almost to poetry by the spectacle of the new kinds of machinery the 20th century had produced. He was fascinated by motorcars. He was fascinated by aeroplanes, by the powerful image of great ocean liners. And as he looked around at this magical new world of the machine, he excitedly declared, "A great epoch has begun." In 1923, in a book called Towards a New Architecture, he argued that architecture required nothing less than a revolution. These great ocean liners should be the inspiration for the housing of the future. It should be designed like these aeroplanes, like these huge concrete grain elevators. It must be different from anything ever seen before. And in his most famous dictum, quite consciously echoing the pre-war futurist Sant'Elia, he proclaimed, "The house is a machine for living in." In 1925, Le Corbusier published a second book, The City of Tomorrow, which was even more revolutionary. Almost everything that had gone wrong with modern society, he argued, could be traced back to the fact that men had to live in out-of-date cities, the old squalid cities which had grown up chaotically. the pack-donkey way. In the age of the machine, we must stop tinkering. We must tear down our old unplanned cities altogether and rebuild them from top to bottom, according to a revolutionary, logical plan. And it was here, in his plan for a city of 3 million inhabitants, that Le Corbusier finally unveiled what was to become one of the most influential intellectual conceptions of the 20th century. Quite consciously taking the ideas of Garnier, of Perret, of Sant'Elia, even of Ebenezer Howard, of all those people who had conceived just a fragment of the total vision, Le Corbusier spelled out just how the city of the future should be designed. Firstly, in the middle, there should be a cluster of gigantic skyscraper office blocks, 700 feet high, each with room for up to 50,000 office workers. Second, these should be at the center of a geometric transport grid, not just of railways, but of great elevated motorways, with a landing strip for aircraft in the middle. As Garnier had suggested, the key to the city of the future should be the rigid separation of functions or uses in distinct zones. So thirdly, outside the office zone, set in a sea of parkland or public open space, should be the residential zone, a series of huge municipally owned slab blocks of flats in which almost everyone should live. By separating housing from traffic, Le Corbusier thought it would be possible to bring an end to what he called the corridor street, the hated illogical idea that people should live on streets full of cars and buses. People should live on housing estates, and they should take their leisure, a fourth ingredient, in the surrounding public open space. The whole city will thus have been transformed into a network of vast housing estates with motorways running between, and giant multi-story car parks for commuters. Fifth, all nasty polluting industry must be pushed out to the edge of the city in special industrial zones. Sixth and last, beyond a green belt of municipally preserved woods and fields for recreation purposes, containing the main airport, there should be a further ring of satellite garden cities, or new towns. This stupendous vision was not just a matter of a new kind of architecture. It was nothing less than the dream of an entirely new kind of society. A society in which Le Corbusier thought that men would be able to live altogether fuller, healthier, better lives. He was in such deadly earnest about his vision that he even suggested to the authorities in Paris that they should give him the chance of a kind of trial run to prove his ideas, by allowing him to demolish the Place des Vosges, the little streets of the Marais, a whole area of the old city, to rebuild it like this. Le Corbusier was, in short, not just a revolutionary, he was a totalitarian on a heroic scale. He wanted to create not just a new kind of city, but a new kind of man. As he said, we must create the mass production spirit. The spirit not just of constructing mass production houses, but the spirit of living in mass production houses. Curiously enough, at the very time when Le Corbusier was conceiving his visions, a German filmmaker, Fritz Lang, was putting together his vision of the city of the future, Metropolis. Fritz Lang saw such a city of gigantic buildings and restless traffic, not as a dream, but as the most appalling nightmare. But certainly to one tiny group of people in the Europe of the late 1920s, Le Corbusier's vision of the future seems stunning, overwhelming. By 1928, a number of avant-garde architects from various countries, including Gropius and van der Rohe from Germany, got together to form a group called CIAM, CIAM, Congrès International d'Architecture Moderne, to evangelize for a complete revolution in architecture and city planning. In 1933, the members of CIAM, many of them later to become the legendary names of 20th century architecture, floated on a cruise through the Mediterranean. Under the inspiration of their most charismatic member, Le Corbusier, they drew up a manifesto for the city of the future, the Athens Charter. And there was no country in Europe in which the ideas of CIAM were received with more excitement than England. Strange as it may seem in that era of the Depression, England in the 1930s was going through a fever of building activity. The 19th century slums were coming down to make way for some of the largest local authority housing schemes the country had ever seen.
500 people have been housed in flats rented at between 7 and 6pence and 15 and 6pence per week.
Come in.
Good afternoon, Mrs. Hardy.
Good
We've just
afternoon.
come to see if everything's all
Oh,
right.
everything's okay.
Good. Good afternoon,
Good
sir.
afternoon.
This is the transformation.
It's much better than the old place. Just like living in a new world.
And even here, the British were beginning to adopt ideas from abroad. These new flats in Leeds, called Quarry Hill, were built quite deliberately in imitation of the huge housing estates which had been put up by the Socialist city authority of Vienna. When, amid the rising political tensions of the mid-1930s, Viennese communists fought a famous pitched battle from one of these blocks, the Karl-Marx-Hof, left-wing legend and architecture became inextricably mixed. For the councillors of Liverpool, as of Leeds, the heroic associations of the style and the size of it all were irresistible. Here, surely, on a massive scale, was the answer to the age-old problem of the slums.
At this ceremony in 1935, Sir Kingsley Wood, then Minister of Housing, opened a new block of flats, one of many that were going up in the city and setting a lead at that time.
Even so, the vast majority of the hundreds of thousands of new houses going up in Britain each year in the 30s were little traditional brick-built suburban boxes, ribbon development along the new bypasses and arterial roads. But here and there, one or two of the younger architects were dreaming of a much more radical kind of architecture. Some even won commissions from rich private patrons to build houses of the kind the members of CIAM were putting up in Germany and France. And in 1932, some of the architects of these buildings got together to form what was called the Mars Group, the Modern Architecture Research Group, to mount an organised campaign in Britain for the ideas of CIAM. Among the most important members of Mars were a group of architects who formed a practice known as Tecton, whose first commissions in 1934 came from the London Zoo to build a gorilla house and the new penguin pool. In 1935, Tecton were given their first chance to put up a building for people to live in, a block of flats in Highgate in London known as High Point 1. No less an authority than Le Corbusier himself was ecstatic. For a long time, he wrote, I have dreamed of executing dwellings in such conditions for the good of humanity. The building at Highgate is of the first rank and a milestone which will be useful for everybody. By the late 1930s, the members of the Mars Group were even beginning to win their first commissions from public authorities. This health centre in Finsbury was designed by Tecton. These council flats in St Pancras were the work of another trio of Mars members. And this, at the time, seemingly revolutionary housing estate in West London was put up by one of the most influential Mars members, Maxwell Fry. The late 30s were a tremendously exciting time for Britain's young architects like Dennis Lasdon, a Tecton member, or Wells Coates, seen here with Le Corbusier. Opening up before them was an enthralling vision, a prospect such as few architects had ever been given before. If cities like London could only be rebuilt, the whole face of society might be changed. It would be nothing less than a new kind of revolution, one in which architects and planners would play the supreme role. In 1939, the Mars Group actually produced a plan for the total reconstruction of London. The city should be rebuilt in a series of linear zones, separated by public open space. Their vision of a new London, blocks of flats standing in parkland surrounded by nursery schools and welfare clinics, seemed heady stuff. But as the men from Mars knew, there was not the slightest chance they would ever be able to carry it out. Le Corbusier himself had spent much of the 1930s designing ever more daring and grandiose plans for the rebuilding of cities all over the world. Rio and Montevideo, Algiers and Antwerp, Buenos Aires and Barcelona. This scheme for Rio de Janeiro, first sketched from a liner, envisaged rebuilding the entire city as one gigantic block miles long, with a motorway running along the top. Apart from this single office block in Rio and a few private houses, nothing ever got built. By 1939, Le Corbusier was the most frustrated town planner in history. But then another man, who ironically spent much of his life fantasizing vistas of cities which would never get built, almost completely unexpectedly gave Le Corbusier's followers in England the chance to put their visions into practice on a scale which they could never have dreamed of. This man, who can perhaps be described as the second most frustrated town planner of the 20th century, was Adolf Hitler. In the first 3 years of the war, Hitler's bombs showered down on the cities of Britain. Vast tracts of London, Bristol, Plymouth, Liverpool, Manchester, Glasgow and many other towns and cities soon lay in ruins. In London alone, the raids of 1940 and 1941 saw the destruction of almost a third of the golden square mile of the city. The East End and Dockland were pounded to hundreds of acres of rubble. Coventry was another city which lost almost the whole of its central area on one terrible night in November 1940. In 6 years of war, no less than 750,000 homes were put out of action by the bombing. Such devastation was unprecedented. But even in those darkest days of the war, the thoughts of men began to turn to the immense task of post-war reconstruction, to the building, when peace at last came, of a new and better Britain. And right from the start, the keynote as never before was to be that magic word, planning. The peace was to be planned as the war was being planned.
Houses aren't built in factories.
You're behind the times, old sport. They are, and they'll need to be.
Fiddlesticks.
Why? If you can build aircraft that way, why not houses? Bits of the wings made in 6 different shops. Bits of the fuselage in 6 more. Engines in 6 more. And the whole lot assembled miles away from any of them. Now, what's wrong with making a house in bits the same way, eh?
As a matter of fact, it has already been done. Here are some experimental types now in existence.
Remember how we cleared those airfields and built those airports? Well, we've got the same machines and we know the new methods. So we can do it again for the new housing sites, the roads and the towns. Yes, and we're going to do it right this time. It isn't only houses we want, it's whole neighborhoods, do you understand? We'll need schools that are handy to the houses and away from main roads. We'll want the shops where we can reach them. We'll want health centers, clinics, libraries, nurseries, parks, cinemas, theaters, the whole bag of tricks, located, designed and carried out to a proper plan. We know how to do it and we're going to do it.
In 1941, the government appointed Sir Patrick Abercrombie, Professor of Town Planning at University College London, to work with the architects of the London County Council in drawing up a plan for the post-war rebuilding of what was still the largest city in the world.
There must be change, always change, as one season or one generation follows another.
Certainly the changes Abercrombie envisaged were enormous. Nothing like it had ever been seen before, even when Sir Christopher Wren drew up his plans after the Great Fire of London.
County Hall want figures and details of street accidents and traffic density in London, sir.
They want it for the plan they are getting out.
Yes, that's right. I've had several talks with them already about it. This is a great opportunity to improve traffic conditions, and we must give them all the help we can.
How does all this fit in with your council's ideas for rebuilding the borough?
Well, naturally, it raises the old question of whether it's to be houses or flats. But apart from that, it does look as if it'll give us the elbow room we've been wanting for years.
It was a project on a scale almost worthy of Le Corbusier himself. Indeed, it was a remarkable sign of the way things were going that one of the most influential members of Abercrombie's team was a man who only 2 years before had played a key part in drawing up that revolutionary Mars plan for London, Arthur Ling.
Well, let's deal with the worst places first. Some of the areas in most urgent need of attention are the industrial boroughs in the east and south of London. Even before the Blitz, reconstruction here was long overdue. There's an almost complete lack of open space. Houses are out of date and jammed in between railways and roads. Schools have hardly any playgrounds and are much too near factories and industry. And there are tenements.
Ling and his fellow planners looked at London much as Le Corbusier himself might have wished them to, appalled by the squalor and chaos of a city which had grown up largely unplanned over the centuries. In 1943, the Abercrombie plan was published. It was scarcely a Le Corbusier vision of a totally reconstructed city, but it unmistakably bore the influence of many of those grandiose town planning conceptions which 20 years before, even 5 years before, had seemed little more than science fiction. Tall office blocks, zoning of the whole city according to functions and uses, slums to be cleared and people moved into vast new housing estates, much more communal open space scattered through the city, industry driven out into special industrial zones. There would be a network of great new motorways to draw off London's traffic.
And the idea is to have 9 arterial roads for fast traffic leading into London. These would join a main ring road, which would keep the through traffic out of the central area. There would also be 2 main roads across the centre of the city.
Finally, London should be ringed with a series of satellite new towns beyond a greatly extended green belt.
It's a pretty gigantic scheme affecting the future of the whole of London. But big problems call for big solutions, and there are parts of London where rebuilding can start right away.
But how was a revolutionary vision like this to be achieved? One thing was certain. The planners would have to be given infinitely greater powers over everyone's lives than they had ever had before. And in the very year that the Abercrombie report was published, the government appointed Mr. W.S. Morrison as the first ever Minister of Town and Country Planning to lay the foundations for the post-war reconstruction of Britain. In fact, as the war came to an end, Britain was looking forward to peace with ever greater expectation. A mood of extraordinary idealism was in the air. A new kind of Britain is going to emerge, a true people's democracy, a much fairer society, planned to give better conditions of life for everyone.
We want a home for every family, whatever its size and income, whether in the town or in the country. There must be houses and flats enough to provide a home for everyone.
I personally think that it would be a godsend if you could get these facilities. And it's up to all women, especially working women, to get together and to insist that we get these facilities at as cheap a rate as possible.
Not only the women, Mrs. Collingbone. Everyone must insist. If we feel strongly enough, we can get what we want.
In 1945, it was that welling up of expectation that gave the Labour Party its landslide election victory.
I ask from you all the support that we shall need to carry us through, triumphantly, through difficult years, to the great era which is opening before us.
The immediate post-war years of food and fuel shortages were hard. Nevertheless, the Attlee government pushed through the greatest concentration of socialist legislation the country had ever seen. Everyone knows about the nationalisation of the mines and the railways, the setting up of the National Health Service. But just as important as any of these was what amounted to nothing less than a revolution in the extent to which the state was to step in to control the future shaping of Britain's towns and cities. The most obvious parliamentary landmark of this revolutionary change was the Town and Country Planning Act, introduced by the new Minister of Town and Country Planning, Mr. Lewis Silkin, in 1947. In effect, this act called into being a whole new profession, the army of local authority planners, who have sat in the town halls and council offices of Britain ever since, giving them powers that were quite unprecedented. Mr. Silkin's vision was this, that in future almost no development of any kind should take place in Britain without the planners, on behalf of the community, giving their explicit permission. The planners should draw up special development maps covering every inch of the country and zoning it for a specific use, and in future no development should be allowed except in accordance with the uses laid down by the plan. Government and planners should be able to intervene even more directly by being able to declare parts of towns and cities as comprehensive development areas, or CDAs, and they were given enormous powers to buy up such areas for redevelopment, if necessary, by compulsory purchase. And not the least important feature of this ambitious expression of socialist idealism was that no one in Britain should ever again be allowed to make money out of property development. All landowners were to be compensated once and for all out of a special fund. From then on, all profits from development were to be taxed at 100%. A second radical innovation was the setting up of Britain's first new towns. Again, a proposal of the Abercrombie report, going back to Le Corbusier's visions of the 20s and to Ebenezer Howard's garden cities before that. In those early post-war years, the first 11 new towns were designated in places like Harlow, Stevenage, Basildon and Crawley.
Princess Elizabeth's visit the other day was in order to carry out a number of ceremonies. A pretty cold day it was, too, for all those taking part. First, the Princess opened the new main thoroughfare.
I have much pleasure in opening this road and in naming it Manor Royal.
A third revolutionary change was the enormously important new role that was to be played in the provision of housing by public or local authorities. Despite the efforts of the pre-war years, by 1945 still only a tiny proportion of the population lived in council housing. Nearly half the people of Britain still lived in flats and houses rented from private landlords. But now, government and local authorities were about to step in a much bigger way.
This is Movie Time. Leslie Mitchell reporting. The Prime Minister, visiting his Limehouse constituency, undertook the pleasant task of opening West India House, a new block of flats at Stepney.
I hope that those who live in these new houses here are going to be happy, are going to be successful, are going to be good neighbors, and are going to be good citizens.
The building, constructed by Stepney Borough Council, is the first of its kind.
We began to become familiar with what was to become one of the most regular features of post-war British politics, the numbers game, by which rival Labour and Conservative governments vied with each other to boast that they had put up more houses than the other.
When the September figures are announced, it will be seen that we have already reached the figure of 750,000 new houses that was the coalition's first target.
But in fact, the reconstruction of Britain's cities proved slower work than might have been guessed from the optimism of the newsreel commentators or the Labour speechmakers. Although 6 years after the war, the new army of planners had set up comprehensive development areas over vast tracts of blitzed cities like Plymouth, Coventry and London, very little had actually been built. Much of the building in the post-war years simply took the form of an emergency programme of 100,000 prefabs to provide temporary housing on bomb sites. As late as 1951, the London planners were even able to declare one of their comprehensive development areas, CDA number 4, as the site for the chief exhibition of the Festival of Britain. As these strange new shapes in metal and glass and concrete rose alongside the Thames, they seemed not so much a record of what had already been achieved as a brave gesture towards a dream world which still lay in the distant future. Many of the festival structures were designed by architects who had been enthusiastic pre-war members of the Mars Group. The festival hall, for instance, was the work of two LCC chief architects who were also to play a huge part in the reshaping of London in later years, Leslie Martin and Robert Matthew. The Dome of Discovery was by Ralph Tubbs, pre-war secretary of Mars. Mars Group members responsible for other parts of the South Bank site included Maxwell Fry and Wells Coates. Another young architect who began to make his reputation on the South Bank was Basil Spence. And in London's blitzed East End, a whole vast comprehensive development area, CDA No. 2, was actually conceived as a so-called living architecture exhibition for the festival, designed by another Mars Group member, Frederick Gibbard.
Here's a model of the market as it's planned for the Lansbury neighborhood. Certainly an interesting comparison with the old market, not that its patrons appear downhearted, but of course they must be eagerly looking forward to the new developments. The new Lansbury will cover about 120 acres, and the King and Queen saw for themselves that the work is getting along well.
Although the Festival of Britain had been a vital beachhead for the new architecture, after 6 years of rationing and austerity, the festival was in many ways not so much a glimpse of the future as a last ghostly flourish of that optimism of 1945, the dream of the people's Britain. Within weeks of the festival's end, Winston Churchill and the Conservatives had been returned to number 10 on the slogan, "Set the people free." And it was only really then, in the early 50s, that the mood of Britain again began to change in an entirely unexpected way.
Sugar bush, come dance with me. Let the other fellas be. Dance the
Austerity and rationing passed away.
Sugar bush, come dance.
At the time of the coronation in 1953, we heard on all sides that Britain was entering a new Elizabethan age. The Queen's crowning was carried by television to more people than had ever watched television before. The TV aerials sprouted across Britain's rooftops, and somehow this seemed to be the key to Britain's new mood, the growing part played in everyone's lives by new kinds of technology.
Sugar bush, I love you so.
More and more people began to own cars. Britain led the world in introducing the first jet airline, the Comet. And another symbol of the new age was the appearance here and there of new kinds of building, seeming to reflect the excitement of the times.
Naturally enough, we see much of it in buildings which by their very nature are modern in their purpose. Places like the new London airport, where we expect something as adventurous and challenging in conception as our conquest of the air.
The new London airport buildings were by Frederick Gibbard, who had designed the festival exhibition at Lansbury and much of the new town at Harlow.
Then the new schools which are springing up all over the country, though these happen to be in London. They are a tremendous step forward in our attitude to education and to the sort of surroundings in which we want our children to learn and play. People come to see our new schools from all over the world, and here we have achieved a standard of which we can be truly proud.
One of the most admired of Britain's new schools was here at Hunstanton in Norfolk. Its young architects, Alison and Peter Smithson, were proud to acknowledge the inspiration both of Mies van der Rohe and of Le Corbusier. In fact, as the supreme guiding genius of modern architecture, Le Corbusier was suddenly no longer a prophet without honour, dreaming of cities which would never be built. As one of the designers of the new United Nations building in New York, he had become world famous. While at Marseille in France, the early 50s saw the completion of perhaps the best known of all his buildings, the Unité d'Habitation, a huge block of flats, inspired perhaps by one of those ocean liners he had so much admired in the 1920s, with its access decks and strange ship-like excrescences on the rooftop exercise deck. The Unité was designed to provide, in the jargon of the architects, a total living environment. The influence of the Marseille flats soon spread to Britain, as in this startling new council estate at Roehampton, put up by the bright young architects of the LCC. In the late 50s, another architect who had been one of Le Corbusier's most fervent disciples back in the 1930s, Denis Lasdun, put up this block of council flats in Bethnal Green, London, which were as high as any block London had ever seen. In an interview with Hugh Weldon on Monitor, Lasdun explained how his widely admired and revolutionary new building would operate like a kind of vertical street, taking the old doorstep life of London 15 stories up into the sky.
And there are intimate little spaces and little views out to London beyond. The building must respond to give you a sort of sense of belonging, a sense of home that isn't frightening. These spaces are as important as the buildings themselves. I mean, Mrs. Jones can call across what is in fact a court, or like a court, an open court on the 15th floor, and she's in some sort of social communion with Mrs. Smith. She's not in a great block where she doesn't know who her neighbour is living 100 feet down.
Suddenly, modern architecture was in. Although no one knew it at the time, the cities of Britain were about to undergo a quite spectacular transformation. Around 1956 and 57, Londoners were amazed to see in different parts of their familiar old city gigantic holes appearing, no longer necessarily just on bomb sites. The demolition men were moving in. One of the great principles of the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act had been that no one was ever again to make money out of property development in Britain. The so-called 100% development levy had in fact been one of the reasons why the rebuilding of Britain's cities got off to such a slow start after the war. One of the first acts of the new Conservative government in 1951 had simply been to abolish that tax outright, to get building moving again. Indeed, this was one reason why the Conservatives were soon able to play the housing numbers game with even more enthusiasm than the Labour Party.
We know now that we have built more than 300,000 houses, new houses, in 1953. And this house, which we are opening today, we have not the official returns, and I must be careful that all this is unofficial, but still, this house which I am opening today is, we believe, about number 310,000.
What few had foreseen was that with the entirely new kind of prosperity which Britain was moving into, it wasn't just new housing that would be needed. A fast-changing society was suddenly demanding much more office space, new kinds of shops. Commercial property was about to begin an amazing rise in value. No one had foreseen this, that is, except a tiny handful of men in the property business, most of them having learned the tricks of the trade in Mayfair estate agencies. The dream was about to pass into quite unexpected hands, and in doing so, it was to produce buildings of a kind Britain had never seen before.
We took the view that if we were going to really attract people to this location, we would have to have an outstanding building, and we wanted one of about 22 stories high.
Indeed, when some of these new blocks eventually rose over the skyline of London in the late 50s, they were among the largest buildings London had ever seen. Buildings like Castrol House on the Marylebone Road were the first to take advantage of the planners' decision to relax the old height restrictions on buildings in London, just as Abercrombie had recommended. Another startling new scheme was in Knightsbridge, developer Harold Samuel's vast Bowater House. And over the skyline of the West End rose the Thorne Building, designed by Basil Spence, one of the heroes of the Festival of Britain. 1959 was the year when Harold Macmillan won his never-had-it-so-good election victory. The people of Britain discovered for the first time that they were living in an affluent society. also learned that they were living through the greatest property boom in history. On the stock exchange, the shares of property companies soared. It became known that the handful of men behind these companies, men like Charles Claw, had already in a few years made fortunes comparable with any ever made in Britain. Other names became familiar: Jack Cotton, Felix Fenston, Maxwell Joseph, and Joe Levy. As a fire watcher during the Blitz, Levy had perhaps foreseen the chances of a post-war property boom before anyone.
During this period, there was terrible devastation of property throughout the city and the West End, with the result that the people and firms who had remained in London and were blitzed out had to have temporary offices for the remainder of the war and flocked to the West End, and thereby, seeing our name, we were able to immediately produce a substantial amount of business, which not only assisted us to continue, but established our name in the profession in quite a sound manner.
It is true that as men like Levy began to transform Britain's cities, there were occasional protests against the pulling down of some loved relic of the past. Vivian Leigh hit the news with her unavailing campaign against Felix Fenston's plan to demolish the St. James's Theatre. The office block which replaced it was one of the first by an architect later to play a larger part in the reshaping of London than any: Richard Seaford. In 1959 there was an even greater row. Jack Cotton, a property man from Birmingham, wanted to put a neon-lit mini skyscraper on Piccadilly Circus. In the end, a ministerial inquiry held by a Ministry of Transport official named Colin Buchanan sent the scheme back to the drawing board. But Jack Cotton was little dismayed. He and the legendary architect Walter Gropius already had plans in New York to put up the largest office block in the world. And appropriately in 1960, Cotton got together with Charles Claw to form the largest property company in the world. In the first 2 or 3 years of the 60s, the skyline of London changed even more dramatically. Even vaster towers began to appear, like Charles Claw's Hilton Hotel looking down over Hyde Park, and the new Hyde Park underpass, the pride of the LCC planners. On Millbank, the new Vickers Tower rose, nearly 400 feet, the first building in London to overtop St. Paul's. Ever larger areas of familiar London, like the old Watney's Brewery in Victoria, were disappearing, to make way for ever vaster schemes. But what, you might ask, as these blocks, each worth millions of pounds to their developers, rose over London, had happened to the planners, those dedicated men who had been going to ensure that future development only took place for the good of the community? The answer is that the inspiration for schemes like these often came from the planners themselves. Take a place like London Wall in the city, where in the early years of the 60s there appeared this startling mini Manhattan of curtain-walled new office blocks. Elevated walkways separated pedestrians from the urban throughway. Britain had never seen anything like it. In fact, this Le Corbusier-like vision was the product of more than 10 years' work by the planners. London Wall had been one of the most heavily blitzed parts of the city. After the war, it had been declared a comprehensive development area. But when it came to be built, each of the new office blocks was in fact allocated to a separate property developer. One went to Charles Claw, another to Felix Fenston, a third to a sharp-eyed young estate agent scarcely out of his 20s called Harry Hyams. Each one of these blocks was to make profits running into millions of pounds for Claw, Hyams and their other lucky owners. What had happened was that by 1960 the planners had entered into a kind of strange alliance with the developers. As the largest of these early post-war comprehensive development schemes, like this one at the Elephant and Castle, finally got underway, the private developers were now playing a central and extremely profitable role in London's reconstruction. This is how, for instance, in the early 60s, the gigantic Shell Centre came to be built on the old Festival of Britain site. Shell put up the largest office complex in Europe on land owned by the people of London, at a ground rent amounting to only a few pence per square foot. And what was happening in London was about to happen all over Britain. If you had actually gone round the provincial cities of Britain in 1960, cities like Birmingham and Glasgow, Newcastle and Bradford, you would have found that apart from areas damaged in the war, they didn't look all that different from the way they would have looked 60 years before, at the beginning of the century. Their skylines were still predominantly low, broken here and there by a church spire or factory chimney. Their centres, their town halls and office buildings and shopping districts were still largely a legacy from the civic pride and prosperity of the Victorian era. Perhaps there were no longer trams, and every year there were more cars in the streets, but on the whole remarkably little had changed. In fact, the main rebuilding activity which had gone on in provincial cities in the 50s had been not in the city centres, but the great drive launched by the government in 1954 to get rid of the last of the slums. For hundreds of thousands of slum dwellers, the late 50s had meant a new world, and by and large they were delighted with the change that had come over their lives.
Well, Mrs. Badham, you're an old age pensioner.
Yes.
How long have you lived here?
4 years. 3 years in July.
You find this a friendly place?
Oh, yes, very.
Well, now you live in a very high flat. How many stories up?
6.
Do you mind living so high?
No.
What do you like about your flat?
Well, it's all convenient, and the doctor said that I was to have a place on the level. I couldn't do the stairs, you know.
You've got a lift here?
We got a lift.
Well, it looks a very nice little flat to me. Anything you dislike about it?
I don't dislike anything about it. I like it all, and I've made myself comfortable, and I wouldn't like to go now.
Well, Christopher and David, how'd you like your new home?
Yes, thank you.
What do you particularly like about it?
Well, we don't have to boil every drop of water now, whereas in the old house we did. And another thing is that of a night time, we have a splendid view all over the city. It's all little.
That's the nice light,
Yes, it is.
What about you, David?
Well, I like the fire because once you light it, it keeps in all the night and keeps it nice and the house nice and warm. And also we have a toilet to ourselves now, whereas in the other house we had to share one and also walk across the yard.
Anything you miss from the old place?
No. None really.
But with the coming of the 60s, Britain's progress into affluence took on a new, more frenetic air. It was not just that the whole pace of life seemed to be speeding up. The opening in 1959 of Britain's first major motorway, the M1, snaking across the countryside from London to Birmingham, seemed a symbol of this change. People were becoming aware of newness, of novelty, in a more feverish way. It was the age of bingo, of phrases like cool and with it. Even so spectacularly unwith it a crowd as Britain's local politicians were swept up into the new mood. All over the country at the beginning of the 60s, councillors like these were beginning to look round their Victorian cities, seeing them as dowdy, obsolete, inefficient, out of date.
Now this is the land I was telling you about upon which the school is to be built. It will be built in an undulating parkland. And I'm hoping, and I believe it will be true, that Birmingham will be one of the most beautiful cities in Europe when this redevelopment job is completed. Now over here you can see some of the type of property in which I was born. Slum property.
Like Le Corbusier 40 years before, councillors such as Frank Price of Birmingham were catching a whiff of the times, dreaming dreams of tearing everything down, commissioning their planners to replace these dreary Victorian townscapes with vistas of shining towers and mighty motorways. The wool city of Bradford was one of the first to plan the replacement of its old Victorian centre by something more appropriate to the new age. The mighty port of Liverpool was not far behind.
Although Liverpool has some of the finest collection of 19th century buildings in the whole country, in the whole of England I would say, it's also got the worst collection of 19th century slums. And this is really
the consequence of this is, and this is a result of the fact that Liverpool had its building boom 100 years ago. So now it's Liverpool's turn for renewal. The cycle of renewal has come round, and it comes round at least once in every century for every great city. And just because about half...
Graham Shankland, then Liverpool's chief planner.
...is right for renewal, and right now we can design a quite new kind of city centre altogether, and that's what we've done.
All over the country, the planners were beginning to talk the same language.
We have to face the fact that far too much of the industrial north looks like hell, and we have to build 10 times as fast if we're going to make any real impact.
We're not moving fast enough. We're 25 years behind events. I think we need to reinvent the city.
There are 36 building years left to the 21st century. One generation in which to recreate the world around us.
And so it came to pass. By 1963, there were no less than 250 separate town and city centre redevelopment schemes in different stages of planning in almost every part of Britain. Some, like Sheffield, were already well underway. One of the most spectacular was Birmingham, where Frank Price had now become mayor. The new Bullring shopping complex, opened in 1964, stood at the centre of a city which in just a few years had already been transformed by that close-knit alliance between planners, local councillors and developers, such as Jack Cotton, builder of the city's famous Rotunda Tower.
This is really the most exciting place, if you've got a soul, that is, a most exciting place to live. This is the greatest and most dynamic place in the whole of Europe, in my opinion.
Perhaps the only place where Frank Price's euphoric boast might have been challenged was the shipbuilding northeast, where one man more than any now seemed to personify the new breed of local politicians who were changing the face of Britain. With his flair for publicity and his hugely ambitious plans for the rebuilding of Newcastle, T. Dan Smith became the most famous local politician of them all. For such a man, nothing seemed impossible. The ancient city of Newcastle was to be reborn.
The intention is to bring the best architects of Europe into the city, and in doing this we think that Arne Jacobsen with Basil Spence and Robert Matthews can produce the kind of city that we know can be created.
Now, if you agree this, sir, I think we will have to look...
In the same year that Dan Smith's plan for Newcastle was published in 1963, the swelling ambitions of the planners all over Britain were given a further tremendous boost.
Extend the cathedral grounds.
A report was published by a government committee led by Colin Buchanan, the official who had carried out the Piccadilly inquiry. He and his team of experts, including T. Dan Smith, were asked to recommend what should be done to combat the growing pressure of the motor car on Britain's cities. The only way the cities could be saved from the motor car, they suggested in effect, was to tear even more of them down, to make way for new ring roads, multi-storey car parks, pedestrian decks to separate people from cars. And to illustrate their argument, they showed how their theories would affect a huge area of central London, 148 acres south of the Euston Road.
Total war on buildings. It would gain a lot, but surely there'd be losses too. There must be things that people would like to keep, even if they do make difficulties.
This is absolutely true. So we did a second exercise to show how buildings worth preserving in the area could be combined with new development. We have preserved Fitzroy Square, for example, and it results in a very interesting combination of old and new, of lower and upper levels. It's pretty obvious that we shall never get anything like this if we rebuild in penny packet installments. We need to tackle the comprehensive redevelopment of large areas, and this will call for a new kind of cooperation from the owners and developers of property.
In fact, as we've seen, this kind of cooperation between planners and developers was already well established. If you had left the area covered by Buchanan's theoretical scheme in those days and walked just a few yards across the Euston Road, you would have come to this part of London. Shabby, run down, but still with a lively sense of community. Several streets of houses, pubs, corner shops, workshops and small factories. But if you had had a word with the people who lived here, you would have found that they were desperately worried. Something very mysterious, even alarming, was going on in their familiar old corner of London.
Have you tried to get in touch with the people who own the property?
Well, we're not quite sure who owns the property. We've been changed so many times with different agents and that. I wrote a letter once to Levy. I'm not very good at writing. Anyhow, I didn't send it. What I said, like, you know, about the housing conditions and all that, I didn't send it because I was no good at writing, you see.
Well, what did you want to tell him?
Oh, I wanted to tell him the conditions we were living in and how long we'd have to stay here and, you know, till we do get rehoused.
If you had come back a few months later, you would have found the scene transformed. The whole area was disappearing. And over the next few years rose this. The Euston Centre, planned in deadly secrecy for more than 10 years, put up by Mr. Joe Levy's stock conversion company, was probably the most profitable single development ever carried out in Britain. But it would never have been built if the planners of the old LCC had not wanted the area cleared of its existing community to make way for a new underpass. For this, the planners made a deal with Joe Levy, which was eventually to give his company a profit running into tens of millions of pounds. Only a few hundred yards away in 1965, you could have seen these buildings disappearing, to make way for perhaps the most famous building put up in Britain since the war. Again, Mr. Harry Hyams and his architect Richard Seifert would never have been given permission to put up Centre Point if the LCC planners hadn't wanted a new traffic roundabout at the bottom of it. Even by the time the scheme was completed, a new one-way traffic system had made the roundabout quite unnecessary. In fact, by the mid-60s, the alliance between the planners and their friends the developers had come to be taken as a matter of course, and they were not running short of ideas. Knightsbridge in London was going to look like this. This was to be the new look of Piccadilly Circus. And so it was all over Britain. The planners' fantasies of soaring towers, urban motorways, civic centres, multi-storey car parks finally seemed to know no bounds. The vision seemed at last within grasp. Television programs like this caught the excitement of the times.
It's almost impossible to know what the new Liverpool will really be like. These drawings are one young architect planner's dreams. But translating dream into reality could produce quite another story. Many different architects will determine the final form of the buildings. They will be inspired by Shankland's plan, but ruled by their own philosophies of design. Your first pint or slap-up meal in the Beacon restaurant will lay the whole new tapestry at your feet. From your cabin in the sky, you will look down on the milling crowds below, or wander through the open spaces of the civic centre, and there you will discover that the pool has been put back in Liverpool.
Good day, sunshine. Good day, sunshine. Good day, sunshine. I need to laugh, and when the sun is out, I've got something I can laugh about. I feel good in a special way. I'm in love and it's a sunny day. Good day, sunshine.
So much was our view of all these things to change in later years that it is almost impossible now to recapture the heady, almost manic euphoria of those days of the 60s. The so-called swinging 60s, the age of swinging London, the miniskirt, pop art, the Beatles. As the pace quickened, the visions of the architects became even more bizarre.
Sunshine, good day, sunshine.
At the time of Expo 67 in Montreal, it seemed quite possible to believe that we might all one day live in strange plastic domes and float above the streets on monorails. And there were those who promised a future more fantastic still, like London engineer Willy Frischmann.
He has come up with a remarkable alternative. What is to stop us building cities vertically, putting a complete community of 240,000 people on a plot of land only 850 feet square? Frischmann says it can be done. The height of his dream supercity, 2 miles.
I'm very anxious for everybody not to get the idea that this idea is just a tall block of flats or a tall office block. This is a vertical city where you can have all the accommodation you need for a city.
That means not only houses, but offices, factories, shops, hospitals, prisons, churches and sewage works would all disappear from the ground and be stacked on top of one another.
Mr. Frischmann was no idle dreamer, but one of the most successful structural engineers in Britain. He had worked with Richard Seifert on Centre Point and been responsible for many of the tallest of London's new buildings.
And as we build the building at higher levels, they're going to use the weight to push the whole building into the earth. We don't think that the actual people who will be using the city will actually feel the sort of movement, controlled movement, that the actual building will be sinking into the ground.
Even though some of the more improbable of these visions were never to get off the drawing board, by the late 60s there was already one way more than any other in which the dream world envisaged by the architects and planners had begun to have a profound effect on the lives of millions of people. One of the most extraordinary and largely untold stories of post-war Britain began in the early 60s. By now, the worst of the slums in Britain's cities had been cleared. To deal with them, the politicians had built up a huge redevelopment machine. And now they switched it on to ever larger areas of the cities, which were no longer even technically slums, but in many instances consisted of quite sound little houses, often well maintained and with back gardens.
Good afternoon. I hope you don't mind me interrupting you. We're interested in the new redevelopment scheme for this area, and I understand that your house comes within it.
Yes, it does, unfortunately, and we're very, very unhappy about it all. We don't want it to come down at all. And after all, we've spent all our money in these little houses, so why should they be pulled down?
The politicians, the planners and the architects didn't like these houses because they were individual, they were old, they were low-rise. In 1960, a junior housing minister, Sir Keith Joseph, coined the emotive phrase twilight areas, which was to help to usher hundreds of thousands of such houses through compulsory purchase to extinction. As the 1964 election approached, housing, the spectre of Rachmanism and land speculation in general became some of the hottest political issues of the day.
Under the Tories' policies and Tory preaching, you have found the speculator who makes money exalted above those who earn money by service to their fellow men. You have found in this country the verb to have come to mean so much more than the verb to be. So on October 15th, we're appealing to you not only to get new measures and new policies and new men, but to get a sense of social purpose and a new scale of social values in this country of ours.
There's one thing I've got to say. There's got to be some changes made. No more black or white.
Harold Wilson was dedicated to forging a new Britain, and after he became Prime Minister, Britain launched into the largest public housing programme in the non-communist world. Still vaster areas of 19th century housing were to be swept away, and the keynote of the new building programme as never before was scale. Vast buildings, vast housing estates of a kind never imagined even in the 50s, rose over Britain's cities. In keeping with Mr. Wilson's faith in the white heat of technology, the secret of quick, efficient construction on such a scale was to be industrialized building, system building. Arthur Ling, who had recently completed 10 years as chief planner of Coventry.
Well, there again, I think that industrialized production will bring quicker housing. We shall see in the future houses coming off the conveyor belt like motor cars. There's no reason why we shouldn't. It's already started, in fact. Big concrete panels are coming off the casting beds into the curing yards and sent off by lorry to the sites. And the amount of building labour on the site is quickly being reduced. We shall get houses much more quickly in the future.
In Glasgow, the system builders were able to boast of the tallest blocks in Europe. In South London, they were able to boast of the longest block in Europe. As Le Corbusier had said 40 years before, we must create the mass production spirit, the spirit of constructing mass production houses. The scale of the contracts involved in the new mass production methods, of course, brought richer pickings for the giant construction companies than they had ever known. But as soon as a new estate was built, the contractors, the councillors and the architects could move on to the next one. For the hundreds of thousands who were moving into them each year, it was a different story. As Le Corbusier had also said 40 years before, we must create the spirit of living in mass production houses. That, perhaps, would not be so easy. In 1965, Le Corbusier himself died. One part of his lifelong mission apparently well underway, the tearing down of the old cities of the past. And oddly enough, it was at about this very time that an interesting thing happened. All over Britain, people were beginning to look at the brave new world that Le Corbusier more than anyone else had inspired with a curious sense of suspicion.
Well, I've had a good deal of criticism already, you know. For example, in the city centre as it now is, there are one or two small restaurants, but there are no bars, there are no places you can get a drink that I could see. There are no places of entertainment. You can't go to theatre, cinema.
You haven't been round as well as you might have done then, Mr. Robertson.
We very seldom let the little ones play on the front balcony because there's always a danger of them climbing onto their toys that they take out, their tricycles or scooters or things. And it is a bit nerve-wracking to think that they might topple over the top.
They say that there's going to be a play school here and playgrounds or play spaces, but there isn't any at the moment, and it's a wonder really that they haven't set aside a small dump for the children to be able to play on, because they only get into mischief if they've got nothing to do.
Oh no, not again. Come on, Marcus.
There was a famous phrase once used by an American journalist who went to Russia shortly after the revolution of 1917. I have seen the future and it works. In the late 60s, the people of Britain had seen enough of the future wished on them by the planners and the architects to know that it did not seem to work very well.
People that live in Manchester have no say. Me, I'll stay there till they put me out, look. They have to put me on the street. I'm not moving.
I know some of the older properties admitted must go because they are in a terrible state. But some of the new properties are not going to be much better in a few years' time because they're so jerry-built.
Well, they pull all the pubs down, the shops, and then start building a block of flats. You're in there for 4 years, and then they start building shops. Yeah. So you have to travel 2 miles to go and get your groceries.
You have your own little bit of ground and your bit of garden in front of you and back of you.
Not up in the bloody air.
And I don't like that the proposed plan, the metropolis come true that they proposed for us. Well, I mean, who wants to live in that? Who wants to live in a tower flat, or even a few stories above, with all the central heating and air conditioning, anything you like to mention? I have to ask a caretaker or please may I hang a picture on these composition walls? Please may I keep a cat? Please may I keep a dog out, see that it's properly trained? In fact, some of these places it would be cruel to keep an animal in. There's no extra. Please may I have some plants? I like a garden. Please may I have a place with a little bit of garden? Conceding that a great many of these modern places you could not do those things. Well, I say that the places that are built where you can't do homely things, the things that make home, the things that spell home, those places are not home.
What was happening to the old spirit of community in those streets of little houses which were being destroyed in their hundreds of thousands? To more and more people, the planner's dream world was beginning to seem like some strange kind of madness. These vast housing estates and tower blocks surrounded by their dead acres of public open space, they didn't house any more people than had lived in the area before, in streets of little houses, often many less. The great tower blocks were so much more expensive than normal building methods that the government had actually had to introduce a special high building subsidy to encourage councils to build them.
I want a bungalow. I want a fancy bungalow. I want a home of my own. I don't want a flat.
Well,
and a flat to me isn't a home of your own.
No, quite. But I'm afraid this is going to be very difficult.
And I also mentioned little blocks of bungalows that were being built. Well, practically finished, they were then.
They're all gone. Look.
They've gone.
Everyone's gone. There's no more left at all. No. Nothing.
And yet when I asked about them, I couldn't have one, and yet there was 3 lots of windows already smashed in.
Yes, but they're already spoken for, long before they finished being built.
No, but this was when they were built and I asked for them.
Yes, but it's very difficult. There are a lot of clearance areas before yours.
Oh, yes,
unfortunately. And there was a long, long waiting list for these houses and bungalows. So that therefore the people that are just arriving on the scene now, like yourself, have got to wait the same length of time as the other people waited. This is the difficulty.
He's been working and slaving his life away. Oh, yes, I know. He's been working so hard. I've been working too, baby. Every night and day. Yeah. We gotta get out of this place. If it's the last thing we ever do, we gotta get out of this place. There's a better life for me and you.
It's a dump. Absolute dump. I've come out of a dump into a super dump.
That little bomber doing smashing.
You're right,
Then in 1968, something happened which was to mark the turning point of the whole story. On the early morning of the 17th of May, the news flashed from East London that there had been a mysterious explosion in just one of the countless thousands of system-built tower blocks that were still rising all over Britain.
Now, what I have done is to assemble a team of experts from the Ministry of Housing, the Ministry of Works and Buildings, and the Ministry of Power, and any other ministry who may be involved, to give me a preliminary report by tomorrow on the factors that need to be taken into account in establishing what kind of inquiry I must set up on.
The Ronan Point disaster, in which 5 people died, shocked the nation. Within months, the government had withdrawn the special high building subsidy. The full symbolic significance of Ronan Point was to continue to sink in for years to come. In the years of the late 60s, as the swathe of destruction brought by the planners spread ever further through Britain, people here and there began to do more than just question the great development machine. They began to challenge it. We began to hear the word conservationists. And if there was one form of development which began to provoke organised opposition before any other, it was the great urban motorway programme, now affecting cities all over Britain. In London alone, a modified version of the wartime Abercrombie plan to drive a series of ring roads through miles of the city threatened the homes of no less than 30,000 people. This was something Abercrombie had never taken into account.
A lady wanted to sell her house and found that she wasn't able to do so. So I promised to run along to the town hall to see what was doing. When I got there, I was horrified to see that a huge motorway had been routed through our estate. The lady's house was on the fringe, but what more concerned me was that my house was in the middle of it.
A series of powerful action groups were formed to fight the proposals tooth and nail. The people were stirring, and the new mood of militancy soon became a force the planners of Britain could no longer ignore.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Alderman Ross, the chairman of the Transportation and Basic Services Committee, and I welcome you here this evening on behalf of my committee, who are indulging in this advanced form of public participation.
In regards to this motorway here, we have Mr. Amos in all good faith. He keeps saying you can't evaluate people moving and all this kind of carry on. You only have to look at this map to see that at least 3 of the routes will upset more than enough people, whereas Route A virtually touches few people at all. Now, you lead us to believe that you are taking all these things into consideration. But I mean, what I tend to think is because somebody designed Route A, which looks quite good on the map, I think you're scared. I think because there won't be so much opposition, you don't know whether you're doing the right thing or not. So you throw a few extra routes in.
As participation became a catchword, the planners began to find themselves in a new role, one that was not exactly enjoyable for them. For the first time, they were actually having to explain what they were up to the people whose lives they were affecting on such a colossal scale.
All right. Well, can I just get a word in edgeways? This is a serious meeting on a serious subject which a lot of care...
Well, will you sit down, please?
If you don't want me to answer, I'll go home. It's a lovely evening. I don't need to be here. But if you do want me to answer, I will stay.
Please, will you give the...
Listen, you know, I mean, suppose we all said, no, we don't want the motorway, a total vote. How would you feel about that?
Well,
in fact, events could scarcely have conspired to bring about a more dramatic concluding chapter to the story. Despite the growing chorus of opposition, as the 70s began, the planners were still unveiling their plans. Indeed, some were more grandiose than ever. Here in Cardiff, for instance, the city fathers and their planners were hoping to launch the largest city centre redevelopment scheme ever seen in Britain. For them, at least, the dream remained undimmed.
The children of Cardiff are facing a future city which will rise from the fall of a condemned past and bring to the surface a way of new life, a way removed from disorder, a way of reaching some concrete expression of tomorrow, where building for tomorrow is a prime need today.
The plan envisaged virtually a whole new centre for the city. More than 1 million square feet of skyscraper office blocks and shopping centres were to be built by Harold Samuel's vast land securities property empire. All this would require an elaborate new system of roads, and Colin Buchanan was commissioned to design them. Another city with an even more ambitious road-building programme was Glasgow, where the city corporation was pushing through a network of urban motorways to match any in Europe.
In the city centre, as elsewhere, the segregation of pedestrians and traffic will mean less noise, fumes, anxiety, a more bustling, thriving commerce, a happier, healthier people.
There was a second reason why in the early 70s the great redevelopment machine suddenly moved into even higher gear. In June 1970, Edward Heath had formed a new Conservative government. In a desperate bid to step up the rate of investment in Britain's declining industries, the new Chancellor, Anthony Barber, released into the economy an unprecedented flood of cheap credit. Instead of going into new factories, thousands of millions of pounds poured into houses, land, office blocks, property of all kinds. House prices doubled in 18 months. It was the beginning of a last crazy spiral of the property boom which had begun way back in the 50s. The value of commercial property soared and sent the property men combing Britain for any new site which could possibly be redeveloped. For Richard Seifert, the most successful developer's architect of them all, the man who with buildings like Centre Point had changed the skyline of London more than anyone since Christopher Wren, it was a heyday. But by now, a remarkable thing was happening.
For me, at my age,
all over the country, quite ordinary people were banding together, not just to challenge, but to fight this massive, impersonal tide of development.
But it is not right that one man should have that power. At least I should be able to be represented alongside that man who wants to place my house in pieces and say it's unfit. I think the system is wrong, which has brought us all to this.
Now, I wonder if we can go on now to the main crux of the meeting, and that is a fighting committee of residents. Can I ask for nominations then from each street? Mrs. Cammack.
But above all, the battle lines were drawn up in London, and in particular in Covent Garden, which the GLC planned to turn into one gigantic comprehensive development area. It was to be the largest streets, Victorian pubs, famous restaurants, were to be flattened to make a new science fiction city of skyscrapers, sunken roads, vast new tourist hotels, and a huge new international conference centre. In 1971, the local residents formed the Covent Garden community, a tiny David against the Goliath of planners and developers.
What I'm trying to say is to keep us all together.
Oh, yeah.
Because if you pull it down, you've got to get out of it, and you break up the community, which is happy.
Yeah.
Which is happy, and you'll never get anywhere else in London.
This is the point. When it all boils down, it's money.
Yeah, well,
because there's going to be a lot more flats. There will be more flats built. When this plan is carried through, there will be actually more flats and more people living here than there is at the present.
But not ours.
But there'll be such rents that people can't afford.
What can we do about it?
Well, I think you've got to barricade your buildings and barricade the streets. That's what it's going to come to the end.
Actually, I agree with what you say, but we're not that cast of people.
As battle was joined over Covent Garden, another tremendous row broke out over a plan by Land Securities, now the largest property company in the world, to erect a vast new office block on the south side of St James's Park. It didn't help that the architect, Sir Basil Spence, had only recently put up another building which had shocked many people, the new Knightsbridge Barracks overlooking Hyde Park. Nor did it help that in the middle of the row, Edward Heath's government gave a peerage to the man behind Land Securities, Harold Samuel, who thus became the first modern developer to enter the House of Lords. And in the House of Lords itself, the Queen Anne's Mansions row even provoked an angry debate, with one enraged peer comparing the vast tower blocks which now seemed to be marching in on old London from all directions, with the Martian war machines in H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds. The whole question of what was happening to London had become a matter of the most urgent concern, even horror. As playwright Peter Schaffer put it,
London was, quite simply, the greatest seeable, touchable, man-made English thing. The visual equivalent to Shakespeare. It was a gigantic act of the corporate imagination, grander than Rome, which has always been something of a village, and more personal, more various than Ramrod Paris. It took approximately 200 years.
Exhibition halls like Olympia and Earl's Court. Markets like Billingsgate, famous railway termini like Liverpool Street, Broad Street, Fenchurch Street, King's Cross, residential squares, well-known department stores, theatres, churches, hospitals, colleges, sports stadiums like the Oval Cricket Ground and White City, not to mention whole areas like Covent Garden, Piccadilly, a third of the City of London, and the waterfront of Southwark. Here, the planners and developers were hoping to replace more than a mile of decaying warehouses with a gigantic complex of luxury flats, office blocks, and skyscraper hotels. One of the chief developers involved, a man whose company, Amalgamated Investments, had risen in the previous few years to become one of the largest property companies in Britain, was Gabriel Harrison.
You've got the River Thames here, you've got the City of London there, the greatest financial centre in the world, with London Bridge coming across to these vast area walls, 20 acres in fact, where we can create a really wonderful development, a challenge greater than possibly any other development had before. So this is Tower Bridge, and it goes right along here to London Bridge. There'll be a large residential complex. I think it'll be a beautiful place to live, to sit in your drawing room in the 8th floor of one of the blocks of flats here overlooking the Thames. I think will be glorious.
The reason for the euphoria of men like Mr. Harrison was simple. Property values in London were now much higher than anywhere else in the world. The values of office blocks in particular had taken off into the stratosphere. This one alone, the Commercial Union Building, was estimated in 1973 to be worth more than the largest industrial company in the country, British Leyland, which at the time employed nearly 250,000 people. 20 years before, the top rent of a square foot of office space in the city had been scarcely as much as £1 a year. Now it had risen by as much as 2,000% and was still hurtling upwards. But as the banks, the insurance companies, the pension funds poured money into office blocks, so increasingly those values came to depend on the absolute certainty that rents would continue to hurtle upwards. If they didn't, if confidence wavered for a moment, there would be terrible trouble. It was no longer a property boom, it had become a bubble, vulnerable to the slightest puff of wind. On this bubble now rested not just the property industry, but many of the most respected names and institutions in the City of London, and already the clouds were beginning to gather. In January 1973, Geoffrey Rippon, the Secretary of State for the Environment, gave his long-awaited official verdict on the Covent Garden plan. On the face of it, his answer was a go-ahead, but by an extraordinary, unprecedented and highly unorthodox manoeuvre, he at the same time declared that some 250 buildings in all parts of Covent Garden should be listed for preservation. In effect, he had scuppered the plan. It was the first really major battle the conservationists had ever won. Two months later, the conservationists had something else to celebrate. A Labour victory in the GLC elections spelt an end to the huge ringway scheme, saving the homes of tens of thousands of people. The new Labour GLC was also pledged to limit runaway office development in London. And over the next few months, the whole financial status of Britain's hugely powerful property industry, centred on a dozen or so giant companies, came under increasingly fierce scrutiny from the press. It was revealed by mischievous journalists that property companies enjoyed a unique immunity to tax. For instance, in 1944, the assets of Harold Samuel's Land Securities had been just £20,000. For 20 years, through the boom time of the 50s, the company's development of offices and shops in Britain's cities had raised those assets by 1962 to what seemed then like a staggering £67 million. But in the later 60s, as the boom continued, and as Land Securities took over other big property companies like the one formed by Charles Claw and Jack Cotton, the company's assets took off, until eventually they rose in just 6 months in 1973 from £1,000 million to an incredible £1,500 million. Yet during all that time, Lord Samuel's company had paid well under 1% of that figure in tax. Another developer, Harry Hyams, was estimated to have made a fortune running possibly into hundreds of millions of pounds, simply by sitting on assets which had doubled and trebled their value in the past few years. Particular criticism was reserved for the enormous profits which property companies seemed to be making out of their long-standing practice of going into partnership with local authorities in vast joint redevelopment schemes, like the one which had been all but agreed between Camden Council in London and Joe Levy's Stock Conversion Company for the redevelopment of this area near Euston Station. The Tolmers Square scheme looked as if it might turn into a repeat of Stock Conversion's colossal coup of the 60s on the Euston Centre across the road.
If we're expected to agree that to do a development on expensive land where the price has been jacked up by speculation, then we must do it in conjunction with a speculator who's already on that land, then we are committing ourselves to doing deals with Joe Levy just about all over this borough, because he owns any potential redevelopment, or he's got a stake in just about any potential redevelopment site in this borough.
The financial terms of the deal won by Joe Levy were so one-sided that they provoked one of the bitterest of all environmental rows.
And stop him somewhere else. It is a question of whether you're ever going to stop him.
As in Covent Garden, the local community fought to save their part of London from simply being wiped from the map by that familiar alliance of planners and developers.
Tolmers Village Association, would you be willing to sign this to stop a property speculator getting a profit of £20 million?
Yes, I would.
Through better put to the use of the people of Camden?
Finally, after a stormy campaign which attracted national attention, the people of Tolmers Square put their demands directly to the council.
1. That the existing community in the area should remain. 2. That most of the houses now on the site will be retained and rehabilitated. 3. That most of the 900 or more...
Faced by overwhelming public opinion, Camden caved in. The deal collapsed. With victories like Tolmers Square, Covent Garden and the London ringways, 1973 had been a year of unprecedented success for the conservationists. But by October, more dramatic events caught the attention of the world. In the wake of the Yom Kippur War, the Arab world's quadrupling of the price of oil set off the fastest slide in business confidence since the war. On the stock exchange, share prices collapsed, none faster than those of property companies. As Britain entered a winter of prolonged political and economic crisis, the miners' strike, massive power cuts, the 3-day week, the property industry reeled under a succession of unprecedented blows. Even the Conservatives brought in a swingeing tax on property development. A Labour government was returned, pledged by the new Chancellor Dennis Healey to squeeze the developers until the pips squeaked. Property shares lost more than 60% of their value. The market in office blocks went into virtual suspension. For 3 years, the banks, the insurance companies, the pension funds have been recklessly pouring money into the development boom against the security of buildings which were suddenly almost impossible to value. The bubble had burst. Some of the largest property companies collapsed in the most spectacular succession of bankruptcies Britain had ever seen. Behind the scenes, the Bank of England and the city establishment were battling to stave off a disaster which at times in 1974 and 1975 looked as if it might bring down the entire financial structure of the country. But the years between 1974 and 1976 marked the end of an era in a much deeper sense than just the pricking of a bubble in the property market. The property developers had, after all, only been the most convenient public scapegoats for the growing unpopularity of a process which had been set in motion not just by them, but by the planners, the architects, the politicians, and, one must say, the whole spirit of an age which now seemed suddenly over. All over the country, the great redevelopment schemes were abandoned, shelved or modified, leaving behind little more than a sea of blight and dereliction. From Liverpool to Cardiff, from Cambridge to Carlisle, the story was the same. Whole areas of half-cleared land and crumbling buildings, bearing witness to the dream that had evaporated. The ideology behind comprehensive planning and comprehensive redevelopment was being jettisoned wholesale. Perhaps no single site in Britain bore more eloquent testimony to the fact than this lump of motorway in Glasgow, a totally useless stretch of concrete costing several £100,000, running between one building and another, without the slightest prospect of ever being completed. Suddenly, in the mid-1970s, disillusionment with the planners and everything they had done to the cities of Britain seemed total. Far from having brought order and harmony, the great experiment seemed to have led to nothing but bleak prospects of chaos in every direction. Every single one of the planners' bright new notions had been exploded, from urban motorway schemes to tower blocks. Even the driving out of hundreds of thousands of factories and small businesses from the city centres had only destroyed their industrial lifeblood, and had led to what by 1975 was being officially described on all sides as the crisis of the inner city. But the greatest post-mortem of all beginning to get underway in the mid-70s was on some of the almost lunatic consequences of the housing programme, which in the 30 years since the war had set out to replace more than half the entire number of homes in the country. It was officially admitted that in just 4 years, between 1967 and 1971, nearly 100,000 houses had been demolished in London alone, and that well over half of these houses had been in good or fair condition. In fact, it was discovered that far from having helped to solve Britain's housing problem, the great demolition programme of the 60s had played a major part in creating a new kind of housing crisis. A study of the largest local authority housing programme in London showed that for every one of the families moved into the new blocks off the waiting list between 1965 and 1974, 2 families, amounting to 10,000 people or more, had simply been evicted so that their homes could be demolished. Hundreds of thousands of houses, many owned by local authorities, still stood empty, awaiting demolition. And it was hardly surprising that a new army of squatters moved in. Mostly young people who could not find housing any other way.
This is a complete concrete jungle, as you can see.
As for the new housing estates of the 50s and 60s, it was now being discovered just how badly constructed many of them had been.
Between the concrete, for example, and the window frames, and all of the window frames had to be renewed.
3 weeks, this whole block?
The whole lot. In fact, both blocks were put up structurally in about 3 weeks, although it took longer to finish. But the tenants had no privacy, no element of civic pride, whatever.
Many of Britain's new estates were either going to cost the country more to repair than they had originally cost to build, or would even have to be abandoned altogether.
Nice enough.
Well, yes, this looks a reasonable living room to you. I mean, it's even got underfloor electric heating, for example, if you can afford to operate it.
What caused all this? And there's obviously damp in these walls.
Yes. This is a condensation problem. What happened? The underfloor electric heating was there. People just couldn't afford to use it. And consequently, they used to use paraffin convector heaters, despite the fact they weren't permitted to have them. Nevertheless, they obviously had to keep themselves warm in some way, and they had paraffin convector heaters, and this created the condensation problem. Indeed, today you can see condensation on the floor.
And that's what just caused this paper to
Yes,
come?
the paper just peeled away from the properties as they stood there.
Amid the wreckage of abandoned housing estates and abandoned dreams, perhaps the most shocking and remarkable fact of all was that by the mid-70s, Britain had more homeless families than at any time in history. Was this what all the proud boasts of the politicians, the planners and the architects had really been about? Or should we now recognise that the great comprehensive redevelopment programme of the 60s and early 70s was the greatest social disaster of post-war Britain? On all sides by the mid-70s, the cry was no more destruction. Rehabilitate, conserve, stop pulling things down. No more concrete jungles. The construction industry entered the worst crisis it had ever known. Architects were laid off in thousands, while adding to the ever longer shadow over the memory of what had happened was the steady flow of police inquiries, arrests, revelations of how the great construction boom of the 60s had led to corruption on an unprecedented scale. The collapse of the Pulsen Empire, once described as the largest architectural practice in Europe, was only the most notorious of a stream of cases from all over the country. And more symbolic than any was the downfall of T. Dan Smith, once the most glamorous local politician of them all, the supreme embodiment of that energy which in the 60s had been going to bulldoze the cities of Britain into a brave new world. It was perhaps a suitable epitaph that in 1976 Mr. Peter Shaw, the new Secretary of State for the Environment, should have officially proclaimed to the world that Britain has pensioned off the bulldozer. But at what a price? In the late 1970s, the tallest office block ever built in Britain rose in lonely splendour 600 feet over the City of London. The National Westminster Tower, appropriately the work of Richard Seifert and Willy Frischmann, the engineer who back in the 60s had dreamed of building a whole city 2 miles high. It was already a monument to an age which seemed over, that age which had begun just 50 years before in Le Corbusier's dream of a city of towers. In less than 20 years, the cities of Britain had been changed out of recognition. Here is the new Birmingham, of which Councillor Frank Price had said back in the late 1950s,
I'm hoping, and I believe it will be true, that Birmingham will be one of the most beautiful cities in Europe when this redevelopment job is completed.
Here was the new Newcastle, the city of which T. Dan Smith back in the early 60s had declared was going to be rebuilt with the aid of the best architects in Europe, a new Brasilia. Was this what Dan Smith had meant when he announced his plan to pull down the old slums of the Scotswood Road, to build what he had once prophesied would be the Venice of the North? Here was the new Liverpool, of which the city's chief planner, Graham Shankland, had said back in the early 60s,
so now it's Liverpool's turn for renewal. The cycle of renewal has come round, and it comes round at least once in every century for every great city.
the new Glasgow, the city which had more motorways than any in Britain, of which the city's own propaganda film had said,
the segregation of pedestrians and traffic will mean less noise, fumes, anxiety, a more bustling, thriving commerce, a happier, healthier people.
Glasgow had also built the largest number of tower blocks per head of population of any city in the country. The notorious slums of the Gorbals had been replaced in the 60s by blocks like these. Many of them built by some of the most celebrated architects of the age, such as Sir Basil Spence and Sir Robert Matthew, who would perhaps have preferred to be remembered for the Festival Hall in London. The new Manchester, once one of the most distinguished Victorian city centres in Britain. And here, replacing the old Coronation Street back-to-backs in the southwest of the city, is the great Hume Estate, which by the late 1970s had become notorious as having the highest murder, mugging and general crime rate of any housing estate in Britain. And this is the new London, the East End. In his introduction to the Abercrombie report back in 1943, the chairman of the old LCC said, "The fate of London in the post-war years will be one of the signs by which posterity will judge us, and by which it is right that they should judge us." Not the least irony of one of the greatest dreams of the 20th century, that dream of an entirely new kind of city, is that it has ended up producing a deep nostalgia for the old cities of the past, for little details of architecture, for the sense of community, for the cosy, familiar, low-rise, human scale of the old streets, for Victorian pubs and corner shops, for houses with front doorsteps and back gardens, One of the unmistakable themes of that explosion of communal celebration which marked the Silver Jubilee in 1977 was that it was like the old days, before the planners came. It perhaps now seemed hard to remember just how unpleasant were the housing conditions, the slums, in which many people had still lived until 15 or 20 years before. But in the late 70s, it was in an almost desperate attempt to recapture at least the human scale of those once familiar old kinds of houses and streets that local authorities all over Britain were once again building low-rise, brick housing with pitched roofs. In fact, this great tidal wave of disillusionment is not something that has just affected Britain. We can see signs of it all over the world, even in America, where earlier even than in Britain, authors like Jane Jacobs were pointing out the horrors of high-rise slums and the rest of the nightmare world brought by the planners. Would anyone say today, for instance, as one of Le Corbusier's biographers said less than 20 years ago, that vast blocks of flats like these in Denmark are a beautiful and human solution to the problem of urban living? The answer given by his admirers is that Le Corbusier's ideal cities were never built. If they had been built exactly as he designed them, they would have worked. Can we really any longer say that, as we compare this sort of thing with those drawings of his ideal city done in the 20s? The truth is that in the rise and fall of the modern movement in architecture and town planning, we have seen perhaps the most universal and tangible example of something which has affected 20th century mankind in so many ways. It is no accident that these flats in Poland are the product not of a democratic society, but of a country where planning by the state, the building of a new society in the name of the people, has been elevated into far greater importance than has ever been consciously accepted in Britain. For the true reasons why the great 20th century dream of a new kind of city, a new kind of society, hasn't worked, we must delve beyond architecture, even beyond politics, to those dark realms of the human psyche which enable us to conceive visions of ideal states, ideal worlds, ideal cities, which seem so enticing in the abstract because human beings can be fitted into them like toys. In the abstract, we may think of the house as a machine, of flats as dwelling units, of people as just traffic flows, employment profiles, statistics, dots, the raw material for a great social revolution. In psychological terms, the architects like Le Corbusier, who in the early years of this century began to dream of a brave new world of shining towers and vast buildings, set in vistas of straight lines, were not all that different from the political revolutionaries who at much the same time in Russia and elsewhere were dreaming of sweeping away the old corrupt society, lock, stock and barrel, and replacing it with their political vision of a perfect world. In the architect's drawings, just as in the revolutionary manifestos, it seemed as if the perfect world, the perfect society, the perfect city was within reach. But in reality, as we have learned again and again in the 20th century, human beings do not fit into such perfect totalitarian dreams. We are dealing here with the most dangerous of all human capacities, our capacity for self-deception on a vast collective scale. The dream of the new kind of city could never have been realized, for the simple age-old reason that when a man begins to talk in the abstract of humanity, of building a better world for the people, it is always precisely those things which he forgets: his own humanity and the fact that people are people. There was once in America to be one of the finest housing estates ever built. The models looked wonderful. The scheme cost many millions of dollars to build. It won prizes and acclaim from all over the world. But when human beings were moved in to the Perret estate in St. Louis, they just couldn't take it. They just couldn't adjust themselves to that abstract vision of a logical perfection. They went off their heads. They broke the place up. And in the end, the planners of St. Louis just had to blow up those prize-winning blocks. a way, the people who lived in Pruitt-Igoe were lucky, in that the planners did at least for once recognise that they had made a mistake. In this respect, the story of Pruitt-Igoe is very much an exception. There are few signs that the planners have really learned the lessons of the past 50 years. All over the world, all over Britain, there are still tens of millions of people who have to live out the rest of their lives in the brave new world that we have created as a result of our dream of a city of towers. In a sense, it's where we all have to live.
Well, later this morning, the series on the United States in the 20th century meets three Japanese-American families who are determined to preserve their unique American heritage.